Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 27th of April of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today have been presented on the screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now the first article appears on page number 14. The article is titled as Hasten the Vaccination and Boost the Healthcare Infrastructure. This article shall be important mainly with respect to GS Paper 2, Polity and Governance, specifically under the subsection of Management of Health. So the recent pandemic has clearly shown us as to how the healthcare sector is in turn linked to various other sectors in the economy. It has clearly shown us as to how a healthcare crisis can well transform into social, economic and political crisis. So in a way, the recent pandemic has exposed the systemic inefficiencies and loopholes in our healthcare infrastructure. It is being said that we must never allow a crisis, particularly a good crisis, to go waste. What this means is we must learn from this particular crisis, understand as to what are the systemic inefficiencies and loopholes, and accordingly address these loopholes in order to improve our healthcare infrastructure. In this regard, recently the Reserve Bank of India has published an article. In this particular article, the Reserve Bank of India has highlighted the grave need to boost the healthcare infrastructure in the Indian economy. It has said that if we do not boost our healthcare infrastructure, then this could have an adverse impact not only on the Indian economy, but it would have an adverse impact on the lives of the people as well. Now, as it is, the topic of healthcare is quite important both from the perspective of prelims as well as mains. But this year, it becomes altogether more important because of the recent pandemic. From the perspective of the prelims examination, one needs to be aware about various government's policies, schemes and programs related to health, such as the National Health Policy 2017, Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. One also needs to be aware about the newly launched initiatives such as the Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Nidhi, Pradhan Mantri Atmanirbhar Swasth Bharat Yojana and so on. As far as the mains examination is concerned, from the perspective of the mains examination, one needs to be aware about three distinct dimensions. The first dimension is with respect to the major constraints and challenges in the healthcare infrastructure. The second dimension is about how to make the healthcare infrastructure more accessible, affordable and inclusive. The third dimension is with respect to the domination of the private sector in the healthcare infrastructure and what problems it has caused and how these problems can be addressed. So these are some of the aspects one needs to be aware about from the perspective of the UPSC examination. Hence, keeping in mind the requirement of the UPSC examination, we will focus upon the different dimensions related to the healthcare sector in India. Let us first understand as to what exactly is universal health coverage and why it becomes important for a country such as India. See, when we say universal health coverage, it essentially means provision of healthcare services to all the sections of the Indian society, irrespective of their socio-economic status. The universal health coverage provides for various healthcare services, which includes preventive healthcare, promotive healthcare, curative healthcare, and rehabilitative healthcare. Overall, the universal health coverage is in turn based upon 4 A's, that is, availability, accessibility, affordability, and accountability. So this universal health coverage can be provided both by the government as well as the private sector. Now, with respect to its importance, if a country is able to provide for a universal health coverage, automatically this will lead to improvement in the health outcomes of the people. So automatically a country would be able to meet a number of sustainable development goals. Not just that, a country would also be able to reduce the number of people living below the poverty line. As people become more healthy, the economic participation of the people would improve, leading to increase in the employment creation as well as their productivity. So overall, this would not only benefit us economically, but it would also benefit us in a social and cultural manner. The government of India has taken a number of initiatives in order to provide for a universal health coverage. Some of these initiatives include the National Health Policy 2017, Ayushman Bharat scheme, and so on. Now, in spite of these initiatives taken by the government of India, the universal health coverage has still today remained a distinct dream. Let us understand as to what exactly are the constraints and challenges. The first constraint and challenges is with respect to the lower insurance penetration. According to a survey which was carried out by the National Statistical Office, 86% of the people in the rural areas and 82% of the people in the urban areas do not have access to the insurance, that is the health insurance. Now you must understand here that these are the people who either belong to below poverty line or they may be just above the below poverty line. So if someone in their family fall ill, then these people would be forced to borrow the money, and if they are not able to borrow the money, they may be forced to delay the treatment for the disease. Now if these people borrow money, then there is a chance that a particular family which is in above poverty line, it may slip back into below poverty line. Now according to various estimates, almost around 55 to 60 million Indians, they have slipped back into below poverty line from above poverty line because of the low insurance penetration and because of undertaking higher expenditure on their own without any government's support. In case if you have not been able to understand the significance of this particular figure, that is 55 to 60 million, let me tell you, the total population of South Korea is 51 million. So what this means is that a population whose size is approximately equal to that of South Korea has slipped back to below poverty line in India precisely because they do not have access to health insurance. So because the government is spending less amount of money, people are required to spend more amount of money on healthcare on their own, and this in turn is leading to a greater number of people living below the poverty line in India. The second problem is with respect to higher out-of-pocket expenditure on health. See, the expenditure on health can either be undertaken by the government or by the people themselves. Ideally, the higher burden of the expenditure on health should fall on the government and there should be less burden on the people. At the global level, the out-of-pocket expenditure on health, that is what proportion of money is spent by people, this is hardly at 18%. So majority of the expenditure in the advanced economies is basically incurred by the governments. However, in case of India, the out-of-pocket expenditure is as high as around 65%. This means that the government's expenditure is hardly around 35%. This higher out-of-pocket expenditure on health is predominantly because the government is spending less amount of money on the health. The combined expenditure of center as well as states on healthcare is hardly at around 1.5% of India's GDP. If you convert this percentage into absolute amount, then this would be rupees 3 per person per day. So this is very low in comparison to the other countries. According to National Health Policy, the government's expenditure on health should be at least 2.5% of India's GDP. Even some of the low income countries such as Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal are spending a much higher proportion of their GDP on health in comparison to India. For example, in Nepal, it is 1.6% of its GDP. In Bhutan, it is 2.5% of its GDP.
So this clearly shows that the Indian government is significantly underspending on health. The next problem is with respect to lack of 4 A's, that is lack of availability, accessibility, affordability and accountability of the healthcare in India. The next problem is with respect to shortage of medical personnel. Now, for example, according to the norms laid down by the World Health Organization, we need to have at least one doctor for every 1,000 persons. But unfortunately, in case of India, the ratio is 1:1,456, which means for every 1,456 people, we have only one doctor. So there is acute shortage of medical personnel. Apart from that, most of these allopathic doctors are in turn concentrated in only some of the developed states. So we do have regional disparities with respect to the availability of medical personnel throughout India. The last problem is with respect to the problems of the primary healthcare. As you must be aware, the healthcare infrastructure in a particular country can be divided at 3 levels, that is primary healthcare, secondary healthcare and the tertiary healthcare. As far as the primary healthcare is concerned, the primary healthcare predominantly focuses upon the prevention of the outbreak of diseases. Now, to provide the primary healthcare in case of India, we do have the primary healthcare centers located at the village level. But these primary healthcare centers have not been able to fulfill their mandated role on account of multiple reasons. For example, the range of services provided by the primary healthcare centers has remained quite poor, wherein these primary healthcare centers have not been able to provide for free medicines or free diagnostic tests. Secondly, the range of beneficiaries covered by primary healthcare centers has also remained quite narrower. For example, the primary healthcare centers have predominantly focused more upon women and children. They have neglected the healthcare needs of the senior citizens and adults. And lastly, these primary healthcare centers have predominantly focused more upon communicable diseases. But as you know, India is facing the dual burden of diseases where apart from communicable diseases, India is also facing an increase in number of non-communicable diseases or lifestyle related diseases. So in a way, the primary healthcare centers have not been able to cater to the non-communicable diseases. So all of these problems associated with the primary healthcare centers are sought to be addressed through the creation of health and wellness centers, which is one of the component under the Ayushman Bharat scheme. Now coming to the implications of the private sector dominance. Now presently the private sector accounts for 60% of the hospitals and 80% of the doctors in India. So overall, the healthcare sector has come to be dominated by the private sector in India. Now this year's economic survey has discussed in detail as to what are the implications of the private sector dominance in the healthcare sector. In particular, it has focused on a problem which is known as information asymmetry. Now, I have already discussed as to what exactly is information asymmetry and how it is causing problems in the healthcare sector in my economic survey video analysis. Now, for the benefit of those students who have not gone through the economic survey video, let me explain this concept of information asymmetry briefly. See, in any economy, free flow of information is considered to be extremely critical. Free flow of information on one hand benefits the consumers, on the other hand it benefits the companies, and in overall the free flow of information benefits the economy. Now let me explain this particular concept by taking example of say laptop. Now let's say you want to purchase a laptop. Now before purchasing a laptop, obviously you have multiple options. Now in order to choose the best laptop among the multiple options, what you can do here is you can log in into your Amazon Prime account. In the Amazon Prime account, you can go through the various options of laptops. You can individually review each of the reviews given by the various customers who have bought the laptops. Now based upon the reviews as well as ratings, then you can decide as to which particular laptop to be chosen. So here basically you use the information for your own benefit, and you use the information in such a way that you are ending up buying the best laptop among the multiple options. Now let's say for a particular example, the laptop which you have bought is malfunctioning. It is not working properly, or it has certain defects. In that particular case, you can give a lower rating to that particular laptop, or you can write an adverse review on that particular laptop. Now, what happens is, based upon your recommendations or the reviews, other customers may decide not to buy that particular laptop. Now, in this particular case, you as a consumer, along with other consumers, are enforcing accountability of the companies. So now the company would be forced to innovate. The company now would be forced to improve the overall functioning of this particular laptop. So now the company is being forced to cater to the demands of the consumers. So this obviously is benefiting the company as well, because here the company, through the free flow of information, is getting to know as to what are the requirements of the consumers. So here, when there is free flow of information between the consumers and the companies, both consumers as well as companies are getting benefited. The consumers are getting benefited in getting the best product at a cheaper price, and the companies are getting benefited by knowing the responses to their products from their consumers. So overall, it is benefiting the economy by promoting the competition. Now let's understand this from the perspective of the healthcare sector. Now let's consider a case where someone in a particular family falls ill, and such a person requires to be admitted in the hospital. Now, while buying a laptop, you have options, and for each of these options you have a facility to go through reviews as well as ratings. But the question is, do you have the same level of facility available with respect to choosing the multiple hospitals? Yes, right now we do have choices with respect to hospitals. But how do you know as to which hospital is good and which hospital is bad? Do you have a review mechanism of hospitals and doctors? No. In that particular case, what most of us would do here is, we would go to the nearest hospital without knowing about the quality of healthcare provided by the hospital. So this is a kind of information asymmetry that exists in the private healthcare. Now, once you visit a hospital, the doctor there may ask you to carry out some diagnostic test. Now, you as a patient may not be aware as to whether this diagnostic test is actually needed or not. Once again, there is information asymmetry. So, it has been normally seen in the private healthcare that some of the diagnostic tests are deliberately carried out even though they may not be required. Now, let's say once a diagnostic test is carried out, the doctor may then recommend a surgery. Now, once the surgery is done, how do you know that the surgery is successful? You would probably get to know about the success of the surgery only after certain duration of time. In case of laptop, immediately you will get to know as to whether the laptop is functioning correctly or not. But in case of surgery, how do you know that the surgery has been successful or not? So once again, there is information asymmetry in the private healthcare sector. So at each level of the private healthcare, you as a consumer would have less amount of information in comparison to the private sector hospitals. So this information asymmetry could in turn be exploited by the private healthcare hospitals in order to make more amount of profits. Now all of this is predominantly happening because of absence of quality regulation over the private sector hospitals. Now in order to address these problems, this year's economic survey has recommended a number of recommendations. First and foremost, it has recommended that we need to set up information utilities on the lines of UK's quality and outcomes framework. So just like how you have credit rating agencies such as Standard and Poor's, Moody's, etc. that provide ratings to various bonds and equities issued by the companies, we need to have information utilities that should be able to provide ratings to private sector hospitals and the doctors. Based upon the ratings given by the information utilities, the consumers can then decide as to which hospital or doctor is best. At the same time, it will enforce accountability for the private sector hospitals as well as doctors to cater to the needs of the patients. It would ensure that the private sector hospitals work in the best interest of the patients. Further, we also need to set up a strong regulator to regulate various services provided by the private sector healthcare. Nextly, we need to implement some of the recommendations of the Srinath Reddy Committee on the universal health coverage. For example, just like how we have Indian Administrative Service and Indian Police Service, we need to create All India Health Cadre for the better management of health. Secondly, presently the doctors in case of public hospitals are not only vested with the responsibility of healthcare management, but they are also vested with the responsibility of managing the public hospitals as well. So in order to better manage the public hospitals, the management related aspects of the hospitals can be delegated to a separate cadre known as the professional health management cadre. So the professional health management cadre would be a dedicated cadre who would be entrusted with the responsibility of looking after the affairs and management of the public hospitals. And lastly, we would have to spend a higher chunk of government's expenditure on the primary healthcare. Some of the other recommendations include enhancing the insurance coverage under Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, increasing the government's expenditure on health to at least around 2.5% of India's GDP, encouraging the public-private partnership in the healthcare. Nextly, some of the countries such as Brazil have explicitly declared right to health as a fundamental right. Accordingly, even in case of India, the right to health has to be explicitly declared as the fundamental right under the Indian Constitution. And lastly, we need to adopt decentralized approach wherein Panchayati Raj institutions as well as urban local bodies should be given sufficient amount of powers, roles and responsibilities to focus upon the primary healthcare system. So these are some of the important aspects which one needs to know with respect to this particular article. As far as these prelims based questions for practice is concerned, I would want you to go through these prelims based questions for practice and respond in the comment section with the correct answer. In case if you have not been able to find the correct answer to these 4 questions, you can attempt the quiz in the ELEARN platform. In the quiz section, both the explanation as well as answers have been given. The next article appears on page number 7. The article is titled as An Idea on Taxation That Is Worth a Try. This article shall be important mainly with respect to GS Paper 3 Indian Economy. This article is also important both from the perspective of prelims as well as mains. As you can see in prelims 2016, we had a direct question related to base erosion and profit shifting. So before discussing this particular article in much greater detail, let us first understand the background to this particular article. See, presently a large number of multinational companies try to shift their profits from high tax jurisdiction to tax haven countries such as Mauritius, Singapore, Hong Kong, Cayman Islands, Panama, Bermuda, etc. So this transfer of profit by the multinational companies from high tax jurisdiction to low tax jurisdiction is referred to as base erosion and profit shifting. Now this base erosion and profit shifting basically takes place through multiple routes which include misuse of double taxation avoidance agreement, treaty shopping, round tripping, misuse of patent box regime, etc. Now this particular aspect of base erosion and profit shifting causes huge amount of revenue loss to the governments. Now for example, according to a research carried out by Tax Justice Network Campaign Group, the total amount of tax revenue lost by the government at a global level on an annual basis, this is as high as around $427 billion. In case of India, the revenue lost is as high as around $10 billion. Further, according to some of the estimates, a total accumulated wealth of almost around $8.7 trillion has got shifted to the low tax jurisdiction countries because of base erosion and profit shifting. Hence, in order to prevent these multinational companies from shifting their profits to the low tax jurisdiction countries, recently the Joe Biden's administration in USA has come up with a grand plan known as Made in America Tax Plan. Under this particular Made in America Tax Plan, the idea is to impose a global minimum corporate tax by all the countries. So this is a proposal put forward by USA. Under this particular proposal, countries across the world would be required to impose a certain minimum percentage of the corporate tax. As per the US, it should be at least at around 21%. Now, US Treasury Secretary has said that this proposal would be discussed before both G20 as well as OECD. So this is just a proposal which has been put forward by USA, and some of the countries including European Union have in principle accepted this particular proposal. Hence, what we would do here is we will try to understand as to what exactly is US proposal with respect to global minimum corporate tax, why it has put forward such a proposal, what is India's position on this particular proposal, and what could be the possible challenges with respect to the introduction of such a tax. Now, before you go through this particular article, I suggest you to go through our DNS dated 26th of September 2020, in which I have discussed in detail as to how the base erosion and profit shifting basically takes place through multiple routes. So unless you don't understand as to what exactly is base erosion profit shifting and how companies shift their profits from high tax jurisdiction to low tax jurisdictions, you'll not be able to understand the concept of the global minimum corporate tax. So in case if you're not gone through this particular DNS article, please go through this particular article, understand the concept of BEPS, and then come back and look at this particular US proposal of imposing the global minimum corporate tax. After having gone through the concept of base erosion profit shifting, round tripping, treaty shopping, etc., you would have realized that a particular company would be required to pay the tax to the country in which it is legally registered. Now, for example, let's say you have a global multinational American company, ABC, and if this particular company, let's say if it is legally registered in India, Mauritius or China, in each of these three cases, this American company would be required to pay tax to the Indian government, Mauritius government or the Chinese government. It would not be required to pay tax to the American government. So since number of tax haven countries have adopted very low corporate taxes, there is an incentive on the American companies to register themselves in the low tax jurisdiction countries. So this causes huge amount of revenue loss to the American government. Hence, in order to reduce this revenue loss, the US government has come up with a proposal of the global minimum corporate tax. As per this particular proposal, all the countries across the world, including the low tax jurisdiction countries, should impose minimum corporate tax at 21%. In other words, no country should impose corporate tax at below 21%. So if a particular country imposes a corporate tax at below 21%, then some form of penalty can be imposed on such countries. But at the same time, you must understand that this is a minimum tax that has to be imposed by the countries. In other words, countries have the complete freedom to fix the corporate tax at above 21%. But the minimum corporate tax should be at 21%. This is as per the proposal put forward by USA. But so far the countries have not decided as to what should be the minimum corporate tax. So as per the proposal, it should be at 21%. So the question is, what would happen if a particular country fixes a tax rate below 21%? First and foremost, as I said earlier, some form of penalty would be imposed on such country. Secondly, a difference amount between the tax rate prevailing in that particular country and the minimum corporate tax of 21% would have to be paid to the country to which the company originally belongs. Now let me simplify this by taking a very simple example. Let's say you have an American company and such an American company is based in Mauritius. Now let's say the Mauritius government has fixed a corporate tax at 15%, that is 6% below 21%. but the global minimum corporate tax is required to be at 21%. So according to the prevailing circumstances, it would be required to pay 15% of its annual profits of $100 billion. That is $15 billion to the Mauritius government. But since the minimum corporate tax is 21% and the difference amount in this particular case happens to be $6 billion. So this difference amount of $6 billion would have to pay to the US government. So the minimum tax liability on a multinational company would be 21% of its annual profits. Now let's take another example of Singapore. Let's say in Singapore, the corporate tax rate is 10%. So in this particular case, it would pay 10% of $100 billion, that is $10 billion in the form of tax to Singapore. The difference amount in this particular case would be 21 minus 10, that is 11% of its annual profits, that is $11 billion would be paid in the form of tax to the US government. So this is how an American company would have to pay a minimum tax liability of 21% of its total profits. Let's consider another scenario where this American company has legally registered itself in India. So let's say in case of India, the corporate tax rate is 21%. And this is equivalent to the proposed minimum corporate tax at 21%. So this particular company would pay $21 billion in the form of tax to the Indian government. Let's consider a third scenario where the corporate tax rate in China, let's say it is higher than the minimum corporate tax at 21%. So in this particular case, it would pay $25 billion, that is 25% of its annual profits in the form of corporate tax to the Chinese government. So the idea here is all the countries should adopt minimum corporate tax at 21%. At the same time, the countries have the complete freedom to fix the corporate tax rate at above 21%. And if a particular country imposes a tax rate at below 21%, then whatever is a difference tax amount, that different tax amount would have to be paid to the country to which the company originally belongs. So this company may originally belong to US, it may originally belong to India, it may originally belong to China, or for that matter, any other country. In that particular case, whatever is the difference tax amount, that difference tax amount would have to be paid to these countries. Now let's understand this from the perspective of India. Now let's say a particular Indian company has misused the provisions of double taxation avoidance agreement through the treaty shopping or the round tripping. In that particular case, the minimum corporate tax rate in the tax haven countries should be minimum 21%. If the tax haven country has adopted the tax rate at below 21%, whatever is the difference amount, that difference amount would have to pay to the Indian government in the form of the corporate tax. So having understood the concept of the global minimum corporate tax, let us understand as to why such a tax has been put forward. First and foremost, see, during the presidency of Mr. Donald Trump, the corporate tax rates in US had got reduced from 35% to 21%. This was basically done in order to attract more amount of investment in the US economy and promote higher GDP growth rate. Now the Joe Biden administration wants to increase the corporate tax rates from 21% back to 28%. But if the tax rates in US increase, this may prompt the US-based companies to shift their bases to other countries. So the idea behind this particular move by US government is to prevent the US-based companies to shift their bases to low tax jurisdictions. The second reason is to target the low tax jurisdictions. So as highlighted before, the low tax jurisdictions have been able to attract huge amount of foreign investment, particularly because of the low tax regimes prevailing in those countries. This in turn is leading to loss of revenue to the US government. Nextly, if you look at the US based technological companies such as Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, etc., these companies have been making huge amount of profits, but at the same time the amount of revenue which they are paying to the US government is quite marginal because of base erosion and profit shifting. Nextly, countries across the world including India have consistently reduced the corporate tax rates in order to attract more of foreign investment and boost the economic activity. According to a study carried out by OECD, the average corporate tax rates at the global level have got reduced from 32% in the year 2000 to 23% in the year 2018. So there is a competition, intense competition between the countries across the world to reduce the corporate tax rates and attract more of foreign investment. So this is considered to be a kind of race to the bottom. Now just imagine as to what would happen if the countries across the world are in an intense competition to reduce the corporate tax rates. If that happens, the overall corporate tax rates across the world would reduce. This would translate into the lower revenues for the government. And if the government is earning less amount of revenues, obviously the overall financial capacity of the government to undertake expenditure would reduce. So there is a need to prevent this particular race to bottom. There is a need to ensure that the governments earn adequate amount of revenue from the corporate taxes. And lastly, the US government has come up with a grand plan to finance around 2 trillion spending program. But at the same time, US government has accumulated a higher amount of debt. The fiscal deficit in US is also higher. So obviously it needs money from some other sources in order to undertake this particular expenditure. And one way of doing this is to increase the corporate tax rates and to ensure that the global technological companies do not involve themselves in tax avoidance strategies. As far as India's position on the global minimum corporate tax is concerned, so far there is no official response from the Indian government. But broadly, if you see India has reduced the corporate tax rate for the existing domestic companies from 25% to 22%. So if you add the surcharge and cess, the effective corporate tax rate for the existing domestic companies would be around 25.7%. The Indian government has also reduced the minimum alternate tax rate from 18.5% to 15%. India has also become part of OECD BEPS project. The total amount of revenue loss to the Indian government because of BEPS, this is around $10 billion on an annual basis, because of which already the Indian government has taken a number of steps such as amendment of the double taxation avoidance agreement to prevent BEPS. The Indian government has signed tax exchange information agreements with other countries. It has also signed and ratified the multilateral convention to curb base erosion profit shifting, which is a convention under OECD. So as you can see so far, the idea behind the introduction of the global minimum corporate tax is indeed a game changer. But at the same time, there are a number of challenges as well as concerns associated with introduction of such a tax regime. What are these concerns? First and foremost, a number of economists have highlighted that this particular tax regime would mainly serve the interest of US, and this would go against the interest of poor and developing countries. First and foremost, as you can see, it is predominantly the American-based multinational companies which have legally registered themselves in other countries. So this is a revenue loss to the US government. And ultimately, when we adopt the minimum global corporate tax regime, the ultimate beneficiary would be the US government, not the governments of other countries. Secondly, so far the US government was reducing the corporate tax rates in order to boost the investment. Now the problem has got reversed. Now the US government needs more amount of revenue in order to undertake expenditure. So it is basically putting forward a global proposal in order to fulfill its own economic interest. So it basically wants to finance $2 trillion worth spending program, and in order to finance that, it needs huge amount of money, and to raise that money, it has put forward a proposal of the global minimum corporate tax. So basically it is the US which would emerge as a major beneficiary of such a tax regime. Secondly, if you look at a number of poor and developing countries, these countries typically use the lower tax rates in order to attract the foreign investment and boost the GDP growth rate. So it is because of the lower tax rate prevailing in these poor and developing countries that they have been able to attract huge amount of foreign investment. So if we force these countries to adopt a minimum corporate tax regime, then these countries would no longer be in a position to attract the foreign investment. The disparities between the developed countries and the developing and poor countries would further accentuate, because then there would be less incentives on the foreign companies to shift their bases to poor and developing countries. So overall, this particular proposal may go against the interest of promoting balanced global development across the world. Nextly, in order to introduce such a tax regime, there is need to have consensus among multiple countries at the international level, and this could be extremely difficult. And lastly, it is being said that such a tax regime can go against the principle of sovereignty, because here countries would lose their freedom to fix the low tax rates. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. Apart from that, please go through these practice questions and try to attempt these questions on your own. The answers as well as explanations to these questions have been given in the quiz section on the ELEARN platform. Now we have taken the next article from page number 3. This particular article actually appears in a form of an advertisement, and it talks about the launch of India's first infrastructure investment trust, which has been sponsored by a Maharatna PSU, that is the Power Grid Corporation of India Limited. Now before discussing this particular article, let us first look into the background. See, in our discussion as part of the Union Budget 21-22, we had discussed about the National Monetization Pipeline. As part of the National Monetization Pipeline, the already built assets by various PSUs would be sold off, and the money raised would then be used to create new infrastructure projects. As part of the National Monetization Pipeline, the assets which have been built by PSUs such as the National Highway Authority of India, Power Grid Corporation of India Limited, Indian Railways, Airport Authority of India, etc. would be sold off, and the money raised would then be used for creating new infrastructure projects. Now these assets which have been built by PSUs would be monetized through multiple routes. The two most important routes happens to be the Real Estate Investment Trust and Infrastructure Investment Trust. See, as far as the Infrastructure Investment Trust is concerned, presently we do have two publicly listed infrastructure investment trusts. That is, two infrastructure investment trusts are listed on the stock exchanges. These two infrastructure investment trusts include the India Grid Investment Trust, and second one is IRB Infrastructure Investment Trust. Now these two infrastructure investment trusts are actually sponsored by private sector entities. Now, for the first time ever, a PSU, that is the Power Grid Corporation of India, is set to launch its own infrastructure investment trust. Already in our budget session, we have discussed about the working mechanism of both Real Estate Investment Trust as well as Infrastructure Investment Trust. So by setting up of the Infrastructure Investment Trust, the Power Grid Corporation of India Limited would sell off its already completed transmission infrastructure. The money raised would then be used to create the new transmission infrastructure. Since the concept of REIT and InVIT have already been discussed by me in the budget session, I would not be discussing these concepts once again. But what you are required to understand here is now a Maharatna PSU, that is the Power Grid Corporation of India Limited, has decided to launch its own infrastructure investment trust. And as per the media reports, the National Highway Authority of India is also set to launch its own infrastructure investment trust in the near future. So since all of these aspects have already been discussed in my budget session, I will not be discussing these aspects once again. But looking at the importance of the National Monetization Pipeline and Infrastructure Investment Trust from the perspective of your UPSC Prelims examination, I will discuss these two aspects in the form of practice-based MCQ. So if you look at the first practice question, the question here is, with respect to the National Monetization Pipeline announced in the Union Budget 21-22, consider the following statements. The first statement is, it seeks to monetize the brownfield assets of the PSUs to raise the capital. See, the brownfield assets are basically those assets which have already been built. Hence, this statement which is given here is correct. The second statement says the revenue earned through monetization would be kept in a separate dedicated non-lapsable fund and should be used for the sole purpose of financing the national infrastructure pipeline. Please do understand here that this particular statement is an extremely worded statement, and this statement has deliberately been included in the question simply to confuse you. So the government has so far not said that it will be creating a separate dedicated non-lapsable fund and the money raised would be used for the sole purpose of financing the national infrastructure pipeline. This statement has been introduced with the sole intention of confusing you. So the second statement which is given here is wrong. Accordingly, the right answer to this particular question should be A, that is one only. Now coming to second practice question, the question here is, in which among the following ways does the setting up of the infrastructure investment trust by the PSUs benefit the Indian economy? The first option is reduce the burden on banks and NBFCs. Second option is attract the foreign capital for the infrastructure projects. And the third option is keep the fiscal deficit under control. Please do let us know the answer to this particular practice question. In case if you have not been able to find out the right answer to this particular question along with the explanation has been given in the quiz section on the ELEARN platform.
With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now the answer to the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option A.